Abraham Lincoln was a Kentucky-born frontiersman and a self-taught lawyer who became the great emancipator and preserved the Union. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th United States President, was born in Hardin County, Kentucky on February 12, 1809. He came from humble beginnings, born in a one-room log cabin. Lincoln's physical appearance was striking, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with a gaunt frame. His family's property holdings were modest at best. He was largely self-educated, having less than a year of formal schooling throughout his entire childhood. Young Lincoln educated himself by reading every book he could find by candlelight. Then in 1816, his family moved to Indiana seeking better farmland and a fresh start in the wilderness. Abraham Lincoln grew up splitting rails and working the frontier farms of the American Midwest. In 1818, when Lincoln was just 9 years old, his mother Nancy Hanks Lincoln died from milk sickness. The loss devastated the young boy. His father Thomas remarried a year later to Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. Sarah encouraged Abraham's love of learning and recognized his intellectual gifts. In 1830, the Lincoln family moved again, this time to Illinois, where the 21-year-old Abraham struck out on his own. Lincoln worked as a rail splitter, a flatboat operator, and a store clerk in New Salem, Illinois. He was a man of the people, rough around the edges but possessed of natural intelligence and wit. Lincoln had an insatiable appetite for knowledge. He studied grammar, mathematics, and literature on his own. He borrowed books from anyone who would lend them. In 1832, Lincoln ran for the Illinois General Assembly. He lost that first election, but the experience gave him a taste for politics. That same year, he served briefly in the Black Hawk War as a militia captain, though he saw no combat. After the war, Lincoln returned to New Salem and became a partner in a general store, but the business failed, leaving him with significant debt that took years to repay. Lincoln called it his national debt, and he worked tirelessly to pay back every penny. In 1834, Lincoln won election to the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. He served for successive terms. While serving in the legislature, Lincoln taught himself law by reading legal texts and observing court proceedings. He was admitted to the bar in 1836 and began practicing law in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln quickly gained a reputation as an effective and honest lawyer. He rode the judicial circuit, traveling from county to county to try cases. His folksy manner and storytelling ability made him popular with juries. Lincoln handled all manner of cases, from property disputes to criminal trials, and he became one of the most respected attorneys in Illinois. In 1842, Abraham Lincoln married Mary Todd, a woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Mary was well-educated, cultured, and ambitious. The marriage was often stormy, marked by Mary's volatile temperament and Lincoln's periods of melancholy. Together they had 4 sons, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, though only Robert would survive to adulthood. The deaths of his children, particularly Willie in 1862, would haunt Lincoln throughout his life. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He served 1 term in Congress, where he opposed the Mexican-American War, arguing that President Polk had unnecessarily provoked the conflict. His anti-war stance was unpopular with his constituents, and he chose not to seek re-election. After his congressional term ended in 1849, Lincoln returned to Springfield and his law practice. He seemed to have left politics behind, focusing on his legal career and his family. But the issue of slavery would not let him rest. Lincoln had always believed slavery was morally wrong, though he did not initially advocate for immediate abolition. He believed the institution should be contained and allowed to die out gradually. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act threatened to expand slavery into new territories. The act outraged Lincoln and drew him back into politics. He began speaking out against the expansion of slavery with a passion and eloquence that captured public attention. In 1858, Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas for his Senate seat. The 2 men engaged in a series of 7 debates across Illinois that became legendary. The Lincoln-Douglas debates focused primarily on the issue of slavery and its expansion. Douglas advocated for popular sovereignty, allowing each territory to decide the slavery question for itself. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong and should not be allowed to spread. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates made him a national figure. His arguments against slavery, delivered with logic, moral clarity, and rhetorical power, resonated across the North. Lincoln was not an abolitionist firebrand like William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass, but rather a moderate who opposed slavery's expansion while respecting the Constitution's protections where slavery already existed. In 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. The election became a four-way race that split along sectional lines. Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in most southern states. He won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote but a clear majority in the Electoral College. Lincoln's election triggered a crisis. Southern states, fearing a Republican administration would threaten slavery, began seceding from the Union. South Carolina left first in December 1860, followed by 6 more states before Lincoln even took office. The seceding states formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the 16th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, Lincoln tried to reassure the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, but he firmly declared that the Union was perpetual and that secession was illegal. He hoped to avoid war, but he would not allow the nation to be torn apart. 1 month later, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. 4 more states joined the Confederacy, bringing the total to 11. The nation was divided, brother against brother, in the bloodiest conflict in American history. Lincoln faced enormous challenges as a wartime president. He had to build an army, find competent generals, maintain support in the North, keep the border states from seceding, and prevent European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. Lincoln had no military training beyond his brief militia service, yet he immersed himself in military strategy and tactics. He read books on warfare and frequently visited his generals in the field. Lincoln struggled to find a commander who could match the tactical brilliance of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. He went through a succession of commanders, including Avin McDowell, George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, and Joseph Hooker, before finally finding his man in Ulysses S. Grant. The early years of the war went poorly for the Union. Confederate forces won major victories at Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. The North had advantages in population, industry, and resources, but the South had better leadership and higher morale. Lincoln faced fierce criticism from all sides. Radical Republicans wanted him to move faster on emancipation. Democrats accused him of tyranny for suspending habeas corpus and imposing martial law. The press attacked him mercilessly, calling him incompetent, a dictator, and worse. Political cartoonists depicted him as an ape or a buffoon. Lincoln endured the criticism with patience and humor, often telling self-deprecating jokes to deflect the attacks. Lincoln understood that the war was ultimately about slavery, even if he could not say so publicly at first. Many Northerners supported the war to preserve the Union but opposed fighting to free the slaves. Lincoln had to move carefully on emancipation, waiting for the right moment. That moment came after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Though tactically inconclusive, Antietam was enough of a Union victory for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, the proclamation went into effect, declaring that all slaves in rebel-held territory were forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war from a conflict to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom. The proclamation did not actually free any slaves immediately, since it only applied to areas under Confederate control. It exempted the border states and parts of the Confederacy already under Union occupation. Critics called it a meaningless gesture, but Lincoln understood its symbolic and strategic importance. The proclamation made clear that a Union victory would mean the end of slavery. It prevented Britain and France from supporting the Confederacy, since European public opinion opposed slavery. It also allowed for the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 African Americans would serve in the Union military, fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of their people. In November 1863, Lincoln delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Gettysburg in July had been the turning point of the war, ending Lee's invasion of the North. Lincoln's Gettysburg address lasted just 2 minutes and contained only 272 words, but it redefined the meaning of the war. Lincoln invoked the Declaration of Independence and its promise that all men are created equal. He said the war was testing whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. He called on Americans to ensure that the soldiers had not died in vain, that the nation would have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, would not perish from the earth. The war ground on through 1864 with terrible casualties on both sides. The battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor saw thousands killed in brutal fighting. General William Tecumseh Sherman besieged Atlanta while Grant pursued Lee in Virginia. The Northern public grew weary of the war and the mounting death toll. Lincoln faced re-election in November 1864, and his prospects looked grim. The Democratic Party nominated George McClellan, Lincoln's former general, on a platform calling for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. Lincoln believed he would lose the election. He even wrote a memo predicting his defeat and asking his cabinet to cooperate with the new administration to save the Union before the inauguration. But Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September changed everything. The fall of Atlanta showed that the Union was winning and that victory was possible. Northern morale surged. In November, Lincoln won re-election decisively, carrying all but 3 states. Lincoln interpreted his victory as a mandate to finish the war and end slavery permanently. He pushed for passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would abolish slavery throughout the United States. Lincoln lobbied members of Congress personally, using all his political skills to secure the necessary votes. On January 31, 1865, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment. The states would ratify it later that year, ending slavery in America forever. On March 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term as president. His second inaugural address was a meditation on the meaning of the war and the need for reconciliation. Lincoln said both North and South had prayed to the same God, read the same Bible, and invoked divine aid against the other. He suggested the war was divine punishment for the sin of slavery, visited upon the whole nation. He called for malice toward none and charity for all, urging Americans to bind up the nation's wounds and achieve a just and lasting peace. The speech reflected Lincoln's deep religious faith and his belief that the war had a providential purpose. By April 1865, the end was near. Sherman had marched through Georgia and the Carolinas, destroying the South's capacity to wage war. Grant had Lee's army trapped at Petersburg, Virginia. On April 2, Lee evacuated Petersburg and Richmond, the Confederate capital. Lincoln visited Richmond on April 4, walking through the streets of the fallen city. Freed slaves gathered around him, some falling to their knees. Lincoln told them to kneel only to God. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Court House, Virginia. The war was effectively over. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished. Lincoln had achieved what seemed impossible for years earlier. Lincoln looked forward to the challenges of peace and reconstruction. He wanted to bring the Southern states back into the Union quickly and without vindictiveness. He opposed the radical Republicans who wanted to punish the South harshly. Lincoln believed that with malice toward none and charity for all, the nation could heal. On April 11, Lincoln gave a speech about Reconstruction from the White House balcony. In the audience was a young actor named John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who hated Lincoln for destroying the South and freeing the slaves. Booth vowed that it would be the last speech Lincoln would ever give. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. The play was a comedy called Our American Cousin. Lincoln sat in the presidential box with his wife Mary, a young Army officer named Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. Lincoln's bodyguard left his post during the performance. At approximately 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a Derringer pistol. Booth leaped to the stage, breaking his leg in the fall, and shouted "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia. He escaped into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson House, where he was laid diagonally across a bed too small for his tall frame. Doctors examined him and determined the wound was mortal. Cabinet members, generals, and family gathered through the night as Lincoln lay unconscious, his breathing labored. Mary Lincoln was inconsolable with grief. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, said now he belongs to the ages. Lincoln was 56 years old. He had led the nation through its greatest crisis and had lived to see the Union preserved and slavery abolished, but he would not see the peace he had worked for. The nation mourned as it had never mourned before. Lincoln's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where thousands filed past to pay their respects. A funeral train carried his body back to Springfield, Illinois, retracing the route he had taken to Washington 4 years earlier. The train stopped in cities along the way, and millions of Americans lined the tracks to say goodbye. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield on May 4, 1865. John Wilkes Booth was tracked down and killed by federal troops on April 26. His co-conspirators were captured, tried, and hanged. Abraham Lincoln's legacy is that of the president who saved the Union and freed the slaves. He transformed America from a nation half slave and half free into a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War showed that democracy could survive its greatest test. His assassination made him a martyr and elevated him to the status of national saint. Lincoln was a complex man, prone to depression, yet possessed of an iron will and unshakable moral conviction. He was a politician who understood the art of the possible, yet never lost sight of his ultimate goals. He was a man of humble origins who rose to the highest office through intelligence, ambition, and integrity. Lincoln's words continue to inspire Americans and people around the world. The Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address are masterpieces of political rhetoric. His life story, from log cabin to White House, embodies the American dream. Lincoln proved that in America, anyone could rise to greatness through hard work and determination. He showed that leadership requires both moral clarity and practical wisdom. Lincoln understood that preserving the Union and ending slavery were inseparable goals, that the nation could not survive half slave and half free. He was willing to use all the powers of the presidency to achieve those goals, even when criticized for overstepping his authority. Lincoln's greatness lies not just in what he accomplished but in how he accomplished it. He faced opposition from all sides, yet never became bitter or vindictive. He endured personal tragedy, losing 3 of his 4 sons, yet found the strength to carry on. He was criticized and mocked, yet responded with humor and grace. Lincoln believed in the better angels of our nature, in the capacity of human beings to overcome their worst impulses and build a more perfect union. His faith in democracy, even when democracy seemed to be failing, sustained him through the darkest days of the war. Lincoln knew that the American experiment in self-government was being tested as never before, and he was determined that it would not fail. Abraham Lincoln was not perfect. He shared some of the racial prejudices of his time. He initially prioritized preserving the Union over freeing the slaves. He suspended civil liberties during the war, jailing critics without trial and shutting down newspapers. But Lincoln grew in office, evolving from a politician who opposed slavery's expansion to the great emancipator who made freedom for all Americans his defining cause. He learned from his mistakes, listened to criticism, and adjusted his policies when necessary. Lincoln understood that leadership requires the courage to change course when circumstances demand it. He was pragmatic without being cynical, principled without being rigid. The United States that emerged from the Civil War was fundamentally different from the nation that entered it. The war ended slavery, strengthened the federal government, and established the principle that the Union was indissoluble. Lincoln's vision of a new birth of freedom would take generations to fully realize, but he set the nation on that path. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, adopted in the years after Lincoln's death, enshrined in law the equality and citizenship of all Americans regardless of race. These amendments were Lincoln's legacy, the fulfillment of the promise he made in the Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln remains the most admired and studied of American presidents. Historians consistently rank him as the greatest president, alongside George Washington and Franklin Roosevelt. Lincoln's life and death have inspired countless books, films, and works of art. His image appears on the penny and the $5 bill. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington stands as a temple to his memory, a place where Americans gather to reflect on the meaning of freedom and equality. Lincoln's words are carved in stone on the memorial's walls, reminding each generation of the principles for which he fought and died. Lincoln's story is ultimately a story of hope. He showed that even in the darkest times, when the nation seemed on the verge of collapse, leadership and moral courage could prevail. He proved that democracy, for all its flaws and failures, was worth preserving. Lincoln believed that the American experiment in self-government was the last best hope of Earth, and he gave his life to ensure that hope would not perish. His legacy challenges every generation of Americans to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, to strive for a more perfect union, and to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln was, in death as in life, the man who saved the Union and freed a people. Jefferson Davis was a Mississippi planter and a dedicated soldier who became the President of the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, the first and only President of the Confederacy, was born in Christian County, Kentucky on June 3, 1808. He came from a modest farming family. He had a distinguished military bearing. Davis's early years were spent on the frontier. He was educated at Transylvania University and then at West Point Military Academy, graduating in 1828. He served as a young officer on the frontier, stationed in Wisconsin and Illinois, where he fought in the Black Hawk War of 1832. Then in 1835, Davis fell in love with Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of his commanding officer, Colonel Zachary Taylor. Taylor opposed the marriage, not wanting his daughter to endure the hardships of military life. Davis resigned his commission to marry Sarah, but tragedy struck quickly. Just 3 months after their wedding, both Jefferson and Sarah contracted malaria. Sarah died, leaving Davis devastated. For the next 8 years, he lived in relative seclusion on his Mississippi plantation, which he called Briarfield. Jefferson Davis was a plantation owner, and he owned dozens of slaves. In 1843, Davis began to emerge from his grief and isolation. He became involved in Mississippi politics, joining the Democratic Party. 2 years later, he married Vaina Howell, a young woman from a wealthy Natchez family who was 17 years his junior. Vaina was intelligent, well-educated, and would become his devoted partner through all the trials ahead. That same year, 1845, Davis was elected to the United States House of Representatives. But his time in Congress was brief. When the Mexican War broke out in 1846, Davis resigned his seat to lead the Mississippi Rifles, a volunteer regiment. He distinguished himself in combat, particularly at the Battle of Buena Vista, where he was wounded in the foot. His military service made him a hero in Mississippi and throughout the South. After the war, Davis returned to politics with enhanced prestige. In 1847, he was appointed to fill a vacancy in the United States Senate. Davis became one of the South's most eloquent defenders of states' rights and the institution of slavery. He argued that the Constitution protected slavery and that the federal government had no authority to restrict it in the territories. Davis was not a radical fire-eater calling for immediate secession. He was a more measured voice, someone who believed the Union could be preserved if the North would respect Southern rights and Southern institutions. In 1851, Davis left the Senate to run for governor of Mississippi, but he lost that election. However, his political exile was short-lived. In 1853, President Franklin Pierce appointed Davis as Secretary of War. In this role, Davis proved to be an exceptionally capable administrator. He modernized the army, increased its size, improved coastal defenses, and oversaw the surveys for a transcontinental railroad. He advocated for the purchase of territory from Mexico to facilitate a southern railroad route, which resulted in the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. Davis's tenure as Secretary of War was marked by efficiency and innovation. He introduced new weapons, including rifled muskets, and he reorganized the army's command structure. His experience in this position would later prove valuable, though in ways he could not have anticipated. When Pierce's term ended in 1857, Davis returned to the Senate, where he continued to defend Southern interests with increasing urgency. The sectional crisis was deepening. The debate over slavery in the territories, the violence in Kansas, and the rise of the Republican Party all pointed toward an inevitable confrontation. Davis believed that the South had legitimate grievances and constitutional rights that were being trampled by Northern aggression. He argued that states had the right to secede if their rights within the Union could not be protected. But even as tensions mounted, Davis hoped for a peaceful resolution. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 changed everything. Lincoln's Republican Party opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories, and many Southerners saw his election as a direct threat to their way of life. South Carolina seceded in December 1860, and other Deep South states quickly followed. Mississippi seceded on January 9, 1861. Davis gave a farewell speech to the Senate that was both sorrowful and defiant. He expressed his love for the Union but insisted that Mississippi's sovereignty came first. He withdrew from the Senate and returned home to Mississippi, expecting to be given a military command in the coming conflict. Instead, on February 9, 1861, Davis received a telegram informing him that he had been chosen as the provisional president of the Confederate States of America. The news came as he was working in his garden at Briarfield. Varina later recalled that he looked stricken, as if he had received a death sentence rather than an honor. Davis had not sought the position. He would have preferred to serve as a general, leading troops in the field as he had done in Mexico. But duty called, and Davis accepted. He traveled to Montgomery, Alabama, the first capital of the Confederacy, where he was inaugurated on February 18, 1861. As president of the Confederacy, Davis faced enormous challenges from the very beginning. He had to create a new government from scratch, build an army, establish diplomatic relations, and manage an economy that was heavily dependent on cotton and slavery. The Confederate States had seceded to protect their independence and their institutions, but they lacked the industrial capacity, the population, and the resources of the North. Davis understood these disadvantages, but he believed that Southern determination and military skill could overcome them. He also hoped that European powers, particularly Britain and France, would recognize the Confederacy and provide crucial support. Davis's leadership style was hands-on, perhaps too much so. He involved himself in military details and strategic decisions, sometimes micromanaging his generals. His military background made him confident in his own judgment, but this could lead to conflicts with his commanders. He had a prickly personality and could be stubborn and unforgiving. Unlike Lincoln, who had a talent for managing difficult personalities and building coalitions, Davis often alienated potential allies. He feuded with state governors who resisted Confederate authority, with congressmen who questioned his policies, and with generals who disagreed with his strategies. The Confederate capital was moved from Montgomery to Richmond, Virginia in May 1861, bringing the seat of government closer to the front lines. This decision reflected the importance of Virginia to the Confederate cause, but it also meant that the capital would be under constant threat throughout the war. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 gave the Confederacy an early victory and boosted Southern morale. Davis visited the battlefield during the fighting, demonstrating his willingness to be near the action. But this initial success created false confidence. The war would not be short, and it would not be easy. As the war progressed, Davis faced mounting criticism. The Confederate Congress often opposed his policies, particularly his support for conscription and the suspension of habeas corpus. States' rights advocates, the very people who had supported secession, now resisted the centralized authority necessary to wage war effectively. Davis found himself in an impossible position, trying to build a strong national government while leading a rebellion based on the principle of state sovereignty. The contradiction was inherent in the Confederate cause, and it plagued Davis throughout the war. Davis's relationship with his generals was complicated and sometimes contentious. He had favorites, like Albert Sidney Johnston and Braxton Bragg, whom he supported even when others called for their removal. He clashed with Joseph E. Johnston over strategy and rank, creating a bitter feud that damaged the Confederate war effort. His relationship with Robert E. Lee was more successful. Lee became the Confederacy's most celebrated commander, and Davis generally deferred to his judgment, at least in the Eastern Theater. But in the West, where the Confederacy suffered its most devastating losses, Davis struggled to find effective leadership. The year 1863 was catastrophic for the Confederacy. In July, Lee's invasion of the North ended in defeat at Gettysburg, and Vicksburg fell to Ulysses S. Grant, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Davis refused to despair. He believed that if the South could hold on long enough, Northern public opinion would turn against the war and force Lincoln to negotiate. It was a strategy of endurance, of making the war so costly that the North would give up. But it required resources and manpower that the Confederacy increasingly lacked. Davis's personal life during the war was marked by tragedy and hardship. His family lived with him in Richmond, sharing in the privations that affected all Southerners as the war dragged on. In April 1864, his 5-year-old son Joseph fell from a balcony at the Confederate White House and died. Davis was devastated, but he could not pause to grieve. The demands of leadership were relentless. Varina provided crucial emotional support, managing the household and defending her husband against his critics. She was fiercely loyal, even as she recognized his flaws. By 1864, the Confederacy was in desperate straits. Sherman's march through Georgia and his capture of Atlanta in September dealt a severe blow to Southern morale and helped ensure Lincoln's re-election. Davis continued to insist that independence was achievable, but his optimism seemed increasingly detached from reality. He proposed arming slaves and granting them freedom in exchange for military service, a radical measure that undermined the very foundation of the Confederacy. The proposal was controversial and came too late to make a difference. In March 1865, the Confederate Congress finally authorized the enlistment of black soldiers, but the war was nearly over. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Davis refused to accept that the cause was lost. He fled Richmond as Union forces approached, hoping to continue the fight from somewhere in the Deep South or even to escape to Texas or Mexico. He traveled with a small group of officials and a cavalry escort, moving through the Carolinas and into Georgia. It was a desperate flight, and Davis knew that capture was likely. On May 10, 1865, Union cavalry caught up with Davis near Irwinville, Georgia. He was taken prisoner, ending his attempt to keep the Confederacy alive. Davis was imprisoned at Fort Monroe in Virginia, where he was held for 2 years under harsh conditions. For a time, he was kept in shackles, which outraged many Southerners and even some Northerners who saw it as excessive and vindictive. He was never brought to trial for treason, partly because the government feared that a trial might allow Davis to argue the legality of secession in court, potentially creating a precedent that would undermine the Union victory. In May 1867, Davis was released on bail, and in 1868, President Andrew Johnson's amnesty proclamation effectively ended any chance of prosecution. After his release, Davis struggled to find his place in the post-war world. He was a man without a country, the leader of a failed rebellion. He traveled for a time, living in Canada and Europe, seeking business opportunities that never materialized. His health was poor, and his finances were precarious. He had lost Briarfield during the war, and he had no income. Friends and supporters provided assistance, but Davis was proud and found it difficult to accept charity. He eventually settled in Memphis, Tennessee, where he worked for an insurance company, but the business failed. In 1877, Davis began writing his memoir, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. It was a massive 2-volume work that presented his defense of the Confederate cause and his own actions as president. Davis argued that secession was constitutional, that the South had fought for self-government and states' rights, and that he had done his best under impossible circumstances. The book was more of a legal and political argument than a personal narrative, and it sold poorly. Critics found it dry and self-justifying, but for Davis, it was important to set the record straight as he saw it. In his final years, Davis became a symbol of the lost cause, the romanticized version of the Confederacy that emerged in the post-war South. He was invited to speak at Confederate veterans gatherings and memorial events, where he was greeted as a hero. He never expressed regret for the war or for slavery. He remained convinced that the South had been right and that history would vindicate the Confederate cause. In 1877, Davis and Varina moved to Beauvoir, an estate on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, where they lived in relative comfort thanks to the generosity of a wealthy widow who admired Davis. Davis spent his last years at Beauvoir, writing, corresponding with old comrades, and receiving visitors. He remained mentally sharp, though his health continued to decline. He suffered from various ailments, including malaria, bronchitis, and neuralgia. Despite his physical frailty, he maintained his dignity and his commitment to the principles for which he had fought. He never sought a pardon from the United States government, refusing to acknowledge that he had done anything wrong. To the end, he believed that the Confederacy had been a legitimate government and that secession had been a constitutional right. On December 6, 1889, Jefferson Davis died in New Orleans at the age of 81. He had traveled there to visit friends and had fallen ill. His death was mourned throughout the South, where he was revered as a martyr to the Confederate cause. His funeral in New Orleans was a massive event, with tens of thousands of people lining the streets to pay their respects. His body was later moved to Richmond, Virginia, where he was buried in Hollywood Cemetery, joining other Confederate leaders in what became a shrine to the lost cause. Jefferson Davis's legacy is complex and controversial. To his supporters, he was a principled leader who defended Southern rights and fought for a cause he believed was just. To his critics, he was the leader of a rebellion that sought to preserve slavery and destroy the Union. His leadership during the Civil War has been debated by historians for generations. Some argue that he did the best he could with limited resources and overwhelming odds. Others contend that his stubbornness, his inability to delegate, and his poor judgment in selecting commanders contributed to Confederate defeat. What is clear is that Davis was a tragic figure, a man of intelligence and dedication who led a doomed cause and spent the rest of his life defending it. Davis's commitment to the Confederacy never wavered, even in defeat. He believed until his death that the South had been right to secede and that the war had been a noble struggle for independence. This unwavering conviction made him a hero to some and a villain to others. Unlike Robert E. Lee, who urged reconciliation and acceptance of defeat, Davis remained defiant. He never took the oath of allegiance to the United States, and his citizenship was not restored during his lifetime. It was only in 1978, nearly 90 years after his death, that Congress posthumously restored his citizenship, a symbolic gesture that reflected the nation's ongoing struggle to come to terms with the Civil War and its legacy. Jefferson Davis was a man of contradictions. He was a defender of slavery who treated his own slaves with relative leniency and even freed them in his will. He was a champion of states' rights who exercised strong central authority as Confederate president. He was a military man who often second-guessed his generals. He was a patriot who led a rebellion against his country. These contradictions make him a difficult figure to assess, but they also make him deeply human. Davis was shaped by his time and place, by the culture of the antebellum South and the ideology of states' rights and slavery. He was intelligent, principled, and dedicated, but his principles led him to defend an indefensible institution and to lead a war that caused immense suffering. In the end, Jefferson Davis was a man who believed deeply in a cause that history has judged harshly. He devoted his life to the Confederacy, and when it fell, he spent his remaining years defending its memory. He was a tragic figure, a leader who could not save his nation and who could not accept its defeat. His story is a reminder of the costs of division, of the dangers of ideology unchecked by moral reflection, and of the human capacity for both dedication and delusion. Jefferson Davis died believing he had been right, but history remembers him as the president of a failed rebellion, a man who fought to preserve slavery and who could not see the justice of the cause that defeated him. Ulysses S. Grant was a determined soldier and reluctant politician who saved the Union and became America's 18th president. Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War general and United States president, was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio on April 27, 1822. He came from modest circumstances. His father, Jesse Grant, was a tanner and businessman. The boy was christened Hiram Ulysses Grant, but he would later change his name. Grant's childhood was unremarkable in southern Ohio. He was a quiet boy who showed little interest in his father's tanning business. He had a natural way with horses. Young Grant could handle the most difficult animals with ease. His father recognized his son's potential and sought an appointment for him to the United States Military Academy at West Point. When Grant arrived at West Point in 1839, there was an error in his registration. The congressman who nominated him listed his name as Ulysses Simpson Grant using his mother's maiden name. Grant accepted the change and the name stuck. He was called Sam by his classmates after his new initials US for Uncle Sam. Grant was an average student at West Point. He excelled in mathematics and horsemanship but showed little enthusiasm for military discipline. He graduated in 1843 ranking 21st in a class of 39. Grant hoped the academy would close before he graduated. He had no great passion for military life. But duty called and Grant reported for service. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Infantry Regiment. In 1844 Grant met Julia Dent, the sister of his West Point roommate. Julia was the daughter of a Missouri plantation owner. Grant fell deeply in love with her. They became engaged before he left to fight in the Mexican-American War. The war with Mexico began in 1846 and Grant saw extensive combat. He served under General Zachary Taylor and later General Winfield Scott. Grant distinguished himself in battle despite his private opposition to the war. He believed the conflict was unjust, an aggressive war to expand slavery. But he was a soldier and he did his duty. Grant participated in nearly every major engagement of the war. He showed remarkable bravery at Monterrey and Mexico City. His commanding officers noted his courage under fire. The Mexican War taught Grant valuable lessons about military strategy and logistics. He learned how to move troops quickly and supply armies in hostile territory. These lessons would serve him well in the future. When the war ended in 1848, Grant returned home and married Julia Dent. They would have 4 children together. Julia became his anchor, his constant support through triumph and tragedy. Grant's peacetime military career was difficult and lonely. He was stationed at remote outposts far from his family. In 1852 he was sent to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. Julia and the children could not accompany him. The separation devastated Grant. He was lonely and depressed. He began drinking to cope with the isolation. Grant tried various business ventures to earn extra money to bring his family west. Every venture failed. His commanding officers grew concerned about his drinking. In 1854 Grant resigned from the army under pressure. The circumstances were murky, but alcohol played a role. Grant returned to his family in Missouri, a failure at age 32. He had no prospects, no career, no money. The next 7 years were the darkest of Grant's life. He tried farming on land Julia's father gave them. Grant called the property hardscrabble and the name was fitting. He worked the land himself alongside the few slaves Julia had inherited. Grant was deeply uncomfortable with slavery. In 1859 he freed the one slave he personally owned, a man named William Jones. This was a remarkable act because Grant desperately needed money and could have sold Jones for $1,000. But Grant chose freedom over profit. The farm failed and Grant moved his family to St. Louis. He tried selling real estate and failed. He tried collecting debts and failed. He pawned his watch to buy Christmas presents for his children. Grant's father finally offered him a job as a clerk in the family leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. Grant accepted the humiliating position. He was nearly 40 years old working for his younger brothers. He seemed destined for obscurity. Then in April 1861 the Civil War began with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. Grant immediately volunteered his services. He helped recruit and train Illinois volunteers. Grant knew this was his chance for redemption. The governor of Illinois appointed him colonel of the 21st Illinois Infantry Regiment. Grant quickly distinguished himself as a leader. He was calm under pressure. He had a gift for seeing the essential elements of any military situation. Within months Grant was promoted to brigadier general. He was given command of the District of Southeast Missouri with headquarters in Cairo, Illinois. Grant's first military action was to seize Paducah, Kentucky before Confederate forces could occupy it. This bold move secured Union control of the mouth of the Tennessee River. In February 1862, Grant launched his first major offensive. He attacked Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. These Confederate strongholds guarded the water routes into the heart of the South. Fort Henry fell quickly to Union gunboats. Grant then marched his army overland to Fort Donelson. The Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender. Grant's reply became famous. He demanded unconditional and immediate surrender. The Confederates had no choice but to comply. The victory at Fort Donelson was the Union's first major success of the war. It opened Tennessee to invasion. Grant became a national hero overnight. The newspapers called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. President Lincoln promoted him to Major General. But Grant's triumph was short-lived. In April 1862, Confederate forces surprised Grant's army at Shiloh in Tennessee. The first day of battle was a disaster for the Union. Grant's forces were nearly driven into the Tennessee River. Grant rallied his men and refused to retreat. He received reinforcements overnight and counterattacked the next morning. The Union won the battle, but at a terrible cost. More than 13,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded. The carnage shocked the nation. Grant's critics demanded his removal. They accused him of being drunk during the battle. They said he was caught by surprise and nearly destroyed the army. Newspapers called for his dismissal. Political enemies lobbied Lincoln to fire Grant. But Lincoln refused. When advisors told the president that Grant drank too much, Lincoln reportedly said, "Find out what brand of whiskey Grant drinks and send a barrel to my other generals." Lincoln recognized what others missed. Grant was a fighter. He did not retreat. He did not quit. He kept attacking. Lincoln needed generals who would fight, and Grant would fight. Grant spent the next year trying to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. The city sat on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. It was the key to controlling the river and splitting the Confederacy in two. Grant tried multiple approaches. He tried to bypass the city by digging canals. He tried to approach from the north through the swamps and bayous. Nothing worked. Finally, in the spring of 1863, Grant made a daring decision. He would march his army down the west side of the Mississippi, then cross below Vicksburg and attack from the south and east. It was a risky plan. Grant would be cutting himself off from his supply lines. His army would have to live off the land in enemy territory. Many thought it was madness. But Grant trusted his instincts. In April 1863, he began the campaign. Union gunboats ran past the Vicksburg batteries at night. Grant marched his army down the Louisiana shore. They crossed the river at Bruinsburg, Mississippi. Grant then moved quickly inland. He defeated Confederate forces at Port Gibson, Raymond, and Jackson. He won 5 battles in 3 weeks. Grant then turned west and drove the Confederate army back into Vicksburg's fortifications. He laid siege to the city. For 6 weeks, Grant's army surrounded Vicksburg. The Confederate soldiers and civilians inside slowly starved. On July 4, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered. The Mississippi River was now under Union control. The Confederacy was cut in half. The victory at Vicksburg, combined with the Union victory at Gettysburg 3 days earlier, marked the turning point of the war. Grant was the most successful general in the Union Army. In October 1863, Lincoln gave Grant command of all Union forces in the Western Theater. Grant immediately went to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where a Union army was trapped and under siege. Grant opened a supply line called the Cracker Line and saved the army from starvation. He then launched attacks on the Confederate positions surrounding the city. In a spectacular assault, Union troops charged up Missionary Ridge and routed the Confederate army. The victory at Chattanooga opened the way for Sherman's invasion of Georgia. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general and gave him command of all Union armies. Grant was now the highest-ranking officer in the military. Only George Washington had previously held the rank of lieutenant general. Grant moved his headquarters to Virginia to personally direct the campaign against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Grant's strategy was simple and brutal. He would attack Lee continuously, never giving the Confederate Army time to rest or regroup. Grant would use the Union superiority in numbers and resources to wear Lee down. In May 1864, Grant launched the Overland Campaign. The two armies clashed in the wilderness, a dense forest in northern Virginia. The battle was a confused nightmare of fighting in thick woods and brush fires. Grant lost more men than Lee, but he did not retreat. Previous Union generals had always withdrawn after fighting Lee. Grant pushed forward. He told his staff, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." The armies fought again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Again, Grant lost more men than Lee. Again, Grant pushed forward. The campaign continued through Cold Harbor, where Grant ordered a frontal assault that resulted in 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour. Grant later said he regretted that attack more than any other he ordered. But still, Grant pushed forward. He maneuvered his army south of Richmond and attacked Petersburg, a vital railroad junction. If Petersburg fell, Richmond would fall. Grant laid siege to Petersburg. The siege would last 9 months. Grant extended his lines, gradually stretching Lee's army thinner and thinner. Lee did not have enough men to defend the entire perimeter. While Grant besieged Petersburg, he sent General Sherman to invade Georgia. Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864. The victory helped Lincoln win re-election. Sherman then marched to the sea, cutting a path of destruction through Georgia and the Carolinas. Grant coordinated the movements of all Union armies. He applied pressure everywhere simultaneously. The Confederacy could not defend on all fronts. Grant's strategy of total war was working. The North's industrial and manpower advantages were overwhelming. In April 1865, Grant finally broke Lee's lines at Petersburg. The Confederate Army abandoned Richmond and fled west. Grant pursued relentlessly. He cut off Lee's escape routes. On April 9, 1865, Lee asked for terms. Grant met Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The two generals sat in Wilmer McLean's parlor and negotiated the surrender. Grant was generous in victory. He allowed Confederate officers to keep their sidearms. He allowed soldiers who owned horses to keep them for spring planting. He provided rations for Lee's starving army. Grant told his men not to celebrate. He said, "The rebels are our countrymen again." The Civil War was over. The Union was saved. Grant was the most famous man in America. He had won the greatest war in the nation's history. Over 600,000 Americans died in the conflict. Grant's military genius and determination had preserved the United States. After the war, Grant remained in command of the army. He oversaw the early years of Reconstruction. Grant supported civil rights for the freed slaves. He believed the Union victory must result in real freedom and equality. But President Andrew Johnson opposed aggressive Reconstruction policies. Grant found himself caught between Johnson and the Republican Congress. Johnson tried to use Grant for political purposes. Grant grew to distrust and dislike Johnson. In 1868, the Republican Party nominated Grant for president. Grant was reluctant to enter politics. He was a soldier, not a politician. But he felt a duty to serve. His campaign slogan was "Let us have peace." Grant won the election easily. He was inaugurated as president on March 4, 1869, at age 46. Grant was the youngest president elected up to that time. He came to the presidency with no political experience. He had voted only once before in his life. Grant's presidency was marked by both achievements and scandals. He strongly supported Reconstruction and civil rights for African Americans. Grant sent federal troops to the South to protect black voters and suppress the Ku Klux Klan. He signed the 15th Amendment guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race. Grant believed in the equality of all citizens. He appointed African Americans to federal positions. He fought against racial violence and intimidation. But Grant was too trusting of his friends and appointees. His administration was plagued by corruption scandals. The Credit Mobilier scandal involved railroad company fraud. The whiskey ring scandal involved tax evasion by distillers and government officials. Grant's personal secretary was implicated in the whiskey ring. Grant himself was never accused of profiting from corruption, but his reputation suffered. He had poor judgment in selecting advisors. Grant's economic policies were also controversial. He supported hard money and the gold standard. When the Panic of 1873 triggered a severe depression, Grant vetoed inflation relief measures. The depression lasted throughout his second term. Unemployment was widespread. Grant's popularity declined. In foreign policy, Grant had more success. His administration settled the Alabama Claims dispute with Britain. He attempted to annex Santo Domingo, but the Senate rejected the treaty. Grant supported Cuban independence from Spain. He tried to protect American interests abroad while avoiding war. Grant served 2 full terms as president. He declined to run for a third term in 1876, though some urged him to continue. Grant was exhausted by politics and eager to leave Washington. After leaving office in 1877, Grant and Julia embarked on a world tour. They traveled for 2.5 years, visiting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Grant met with kings and emperors. He was celebrated everywhere as the man who saved the American Union. The tour restored Grant's reputation and spirits. When Grant returned to America in 1879, there was talk of nominating him for a third term as president. Grant allowed his name to be put forward at the 1880 Republican Convention. He led on the early ballots but could not secure the nomination. James Garfield eventually won the nomination and the presidency. Grant settled in New York City. He needed to earn money. His savings were modest and he had a family to support. Grant became a partner in a Wall Street investment firm called Grant & Ward. His son was involved in the business. Grant invested all his money in the firm. He believed his partners were honest men. In 1884, the firm collapsed. Grant's partner Ferdinand Ward had been running a Ponzi scheme. All of Grant's money was gone. He was bankrupt at age 62. Grant was devastated and humiliated. He had been swindled by men he trusted. Friends raised money to help the family. Grant was too proud to accept charity. He needed to provide for Julia. Around this time, Grant developed throat cancer from years of smoking cigars. He was in constant pain. Doctors told him he had less than a year to live. Grant decided to write his memoirs to provide financial security for his family. Mark Twain offered to publish the book and promised generous royalty terms. Grant worked frantically to finish the manuscript. He was racing against death. The cancer spread to his tongue and mouth. Grant could barely speak or swallow. He wrote in pencil on pads of paper. He pushed through the pain and exhaustion. Grant's memoirs covered his early life and focused heavily on his Civil War campaigns. The writing was clear, direct, and honest. Grant had a natural talent for prose. He wrote without pretension or self-glorification. Grant finished the manuscript just days before he died. On July 23, 1885, Ulysses S. Grant died at a cottage in the Adirondack Mountains. He was 63 years old. His last words were reportedly, "I am thankful for having been enabled to do so much for my family." Grant's funeral was one of the largest in American history. More than 1.5 million people lined the streets of New York to watch the funeral procession. Presidents and generals marched behind the hearse. Former Confederate generals served as pallbearers alongside Union generals. Grant was buried in a massive tomb overlooking the Hudson River in New York City. Grant's memoirs were published shortly after his death. The book was a critical and commercial success. It sold 300,000 copies and earned nearly $500,000 in royalties for Julia. The memoirs are considered one of the finest military autobiographies ever written. Grant secured his family's future even in death. Ulysses S. Grant's legacy is complex and contested. As a general, he was brilliant. He understood modern warfare. He grasped that wars are won through relentless pressure and superior resources. Grant was willing to accept casualties to achieve victory. He coordinated multiple armies across vast distances. He was the architect of Union victory. As President, Grant was less successful. His administration was marked by scandal, though Grant himself was honest. He supported civil rights and fought against the Klan. But he could not overcome the political and economic challenges of his time. Reconstruction ultimately failed, and African Americans in the South lost the rights Grant tried to protect. Grant's personal life was marked by failure and redemption. He failed at nearly everything before the Civil War. He struggled with alcohol throughout his life. He was swindled and bankrupted in his final years. But Grant never gave up. He always fought back. He redeemed himself through determination and courage. Grant was a man of contradictions. He was a gentle person who became a fierce warrior. He hated slavery but married into a slave-holding family. He was modest and unassuming but commanded vast armies. He was trusting to a fault but learned hard lessons about human nature. Grant's greatest strength was his ability to see what needed to be done and do it. He did not overcomplicate matters. He assessed the situation, made a decision, and acted. When he failed, he tried again. Grant never lost sight of his objective. During the Civil War, his objective was to destroy the Confederate armies and restore the Union. He pursued that goal with single-minded determination. Nothing distracted him. Setbacks did not discourage him. He kept moving forward. Grant understood that wars are won by the side that refuses to quit. He would not quit. Grant's military reputation has grown over time. Modern historians rank him among America's greatest generals alongside Washington and Eisenhower. His Vicksburg campaign is studied as a masterpiece of military art. His coordination of multiple armies in 1864 and 1865 demonstrated strategic genius. Grant revolutionized American warfare. He understood that destroying the enemy's army, not capturing territory, was the key to victory. He grasped the importance of logistics and supply. He used railroads and rivers to move troops and materials. He adapted to changing battlefield conditions. Grant also understood the political dimensions of war. He recognized that Northern public opinion demanded results. He knew Lincoln needed military victories to maintain support for the war. Grant delivered those victories. Grant's presidency is viewed more favorably by recent historians. They credit him with fighting for civil rights during Reconstruction. Grant used federal power to protect African Americans from racial violence. He crushed the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina. He appointed Black Americans to federal offices. He supported the 15th Amendment. Grant believed the Civil War must result in real equality. He fought for that principle even when it was politically unpopular. But Grant could not overcome the forces of white supremacy in the South. Northern support for Reconstruction waned. The Supreme Court limited federal power to protect civil rights. By the end of Grant's presidency, Reconstruction was failing. The gains of the war years were being rolled back. It would take another century before the civil rights movement achieved what Grant fought for. Grant died believing he had failed his country as president. He was wrong. He had done more than any president between Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson to advance civil rights. His efforts were thwarted by circumstances beyond his control. Ulysses S. Grant was a man who rose from obscurity to save his nation. He was an unlikely hero, a failed businessman who became a great general. He was a reluctant politician who fought for justice. He was a devoted husband and father who sacrificed everything for his family. Grant's life teaches us that failure is not final. Redemption is always possible. Determination and courage can overcome any obstacle. Grant never gave up, and neither should we. He remains an inspiration and a reminder of what Americans can achieve when they refuse to surrender.